Ohio, a state with a rich and unique history. A frontier territory which saw extensive early trade between natives and Europeans, as well as some of the fiercest battles between the two sides during both the colonial and national eras. It played a key role in the nation's early expansion west, securing it an influential position within the US, one which it maintains to this day. Join us as we explore this fascinating gem of the Midwest. Native American settlement in Ohio can be dated as far back as 11,000 BC, with the ancient population hunting large land animals and foraging from the landscape. This early period, known as the Archaic Era, extended from 8,000 to 1,000 BC. It consisted mostly of small nomadic groups following the migration patterns of their prey. We then have the emergence of the first groups slightly better known to history due to the legacy left behind. These included the Hopewell and Adena cultures, which flourished between around 100 BC and 500 AD. They were more organized societies, with larger settlements approaching the size of small towns. Often called the Hopewell exchange culture, due to the groups being connected by a trade route, but ultimately with their own unique characteristics. The area of influence of the culture was considerable, extending from the Gulf of Mexico in the south up to Ohio and Illinois in the north. While not an empire exerting direct territorial control, it demonstrates the developed and interconnected nature of these groups operating across huge geographic areas. The waterways of the Mississippi, Illinois, and Tennessee rivers were a crucial part of this culture. Almost certainly making use of birch bark canoes to traverse the vast system, native peoples traded furs, metals, food, and tools. Both the Adena and Hopewell were prolific mound builders, the remains of many of which can be found in Ohio. Likely used for astronomical observation as well as rituals, they demonstrate a high level of social organization and enough surplus resources to commit to such large-scale building projects. Over 10,000 mounds used as burial sites have been identified in southern Ohio alone, as well as the discovery of a huge fortification from this period with a circumference of around 3.5 miles. Of all the mounds left by these cultures, Serpent Mound remains the most enigmatic and globally known. Found in Adams County, Ohio, it was constructed either by the Adena people around 300 BC or by the later Fort Ancient culture around 1000 AD, with some uncertainty left by the carbon dating. Stretching over 1,300 feet in length, it artistically depicts a serpent in motion. Interestingly, it can only be fully appreciated from above, itself presenting a series of questions as to why a culture at this time would have aimed for that effect. As the Hopewell and Adena faded, another contemporary, the Fort Ancient culture, would persist in Ohio. Operating during the same period as the great Mississippian culture, which had now risen to the south and west, yet with their own distinct traits. They were smaller in scale than the Mississippians, who had built the largest structures outside Mesoamerica in their spiritual center of Cahokia in Illinois. However, they were still a developed culture, practicing a mix of semi-nomadism alongside crop cultivation, including the staples of corn, squash, and beans. The cultures of the region had also now perfected a growing technique known as the Three Sisters, which involves the combination planting of these three staples in single areas. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, squash provides the ground cover and weed protection, while the maize forms the canopy, with its stalks also supporting the climbing growth of the beans. All interconnect and aid the others in this innovative growth system, which played an important role in supporting communities and maintaining soil fertility of the region. The Fort Ancient culture would remain present in Ohio through to the 1750s, even as the larger Mississippian culture to the south and west of them disintegrated. These changes in dynamics in the centuries leading up to European contact would result in a more loosely organized patchwork of tribal peoples, generally operating in smaller groups again. Ohio would also play host to some new migratory tribes who had been uprooted by a rising threat in the form of the fearsome Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois were a powerful group whose traditional homelands lay to the east in New York State. Through the later 16th century, they had begun pushing westward as part of a drive to expand their territories and hunting grounds. They were fearsome warriors, known for their stealth nighttime raids. Approaching in silence by canoe, they would often then sink and weigh down the vessels on arrival, carry out the raid, then retreat before enemy forces could properly organize. The Iroquois Confederacy's deadly campaign had forced out many groups around the eastern shores of Lake Erie, pushing them west into modern-day Ohio. Their expansion upended the power balance in the region, with new tribes arriving putting pressure on pre-existing groups. Alongside the collapse of the Mississippian culture in the decades prior, this left the tribal makeup of Ohio in a fractured state at the point in time Europeans would first arrive. This effect would also be compounded by the incoming wave of disease from new European communities on the Atlantic coast through the early 1600s. These diseases almost certainly traveled ahead of direct contact via the well-established native trade networks. Smallpox, measles, and influenza proved particularly lethal and were diseases the native population had no natural immunity to. While losses were likely highest further east, it's expected that the native population of Ohio would still likely have suffered anywhere from 25 to 50% total death rates from successive waves of these epidemics through the 1600s. This again left communities fractured and the previous power balance altered, ideal conditions for incoming colonial powers to exploit. The first sustained European contact came in the form of French and Dutch traders in the early 1600s. They were eager for fur, primarily beaver pelts, which these rich hunting grounds had in abundance. Though traders would be focused more to the north and east during the first half of the century, their attention would turn to Ohio as the trade expanded west. The Iroquois sought to dominate the industry, with the large profits available quickly apparent. As the French, Dutch, and British sent ever more traders into the Great Lakes and Midwest regions for the commodity, the Iroquois continued their expansion west to secure more hunting grounds to meet demand. These later drives are known as the Beaver Wars and became ever more deadly as the Iroquois essentially established a monopoly on early firearms through dominating trade with the French and British. In return for a portion of their beaver pelts, they would get smooth-bore muskets from the Europeans, a lethal accompaniment in raiding parties against communities without any firearms of their own. Into the late 1600s, the French had become the dominant colonial force in the region. In 1683, Ohio Country was declared a part of New France, part of a network of control that had extended out from their early northern holdings in the Hudson Bay area of modern-day Canada. They now nominally controlled a vast area of territory encompassing the regions of Ohio and Illinois, right down to the lower Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. In 1749, they also attempted to further their claim to the land by dropping lead plates at key points in Ohio's waterways, proclaiming it as a possession of the French crown. To serve the fur trade, which had only grown in importance, they constructed outposts along the river systems which acted as both defensive positions and trading posts where the native peoples could bring their fur pelts for sale. They could not be characterized as full-scale settlement yet, though. This was still very much a trading relationship. It would take the formation of the nation to herald in this next key change. The French would continue to generate huge profits from their fur trade operations, and as tensions rose with the British, it also produced the first forts in Ohio. This included Fort Duquesne, built in 1754. The French and Indian Wars would break out the same year, as the American front of the 7 Years' War being waged in Europe. They were the culmination of a series of conflicts which had been fought between the two sides in America since King William's War of 1688. Motives included control of both territories and the lucrative trapping trade. Numerous battles of the French and Indian Wars would occur in Ohio country, including at Fort Duquesne, which the French would lose to the British. The conclusion of the war proved disastrous for France. They would lose their sprawling empire to the British as part of the peace negotiations, though the British themselves wouldn't get a chance to benefit from them for long, with a new seismic change on the horizon. The American Revolutionary War focused primarily on the East Coast, but saw Ohio country play an important secondary role. It had long been a frontier region, and as hostilities broke out in 1775, the British in Fort Detroit and the region to the north would seek to use it as a power base to arm and supply Ohio native allies. These tribal groups would then harass settlers and militias to the east and areas under the colonists' control. This skirmishing action helped tie up militiamen in Ohio country, as well as act as a distraction for U.S. forces. It would not, however, change the outcome of the war, and with Britain defeated, they ceded Ohio to America. The land gained as part of the peace deal opened up huge new areas of territory for the fledgling nation, and unlike the British and French colonial approach, which had focused on trading, the new American model would be centered around settlement. The Land Ordinance Act of 1785 established a system to allocate land in newly claimed Ohio and began a formalizing process towards statehood. This was followed in 1787 by the Northwest Ordinance. This established the Northwest Territory, a huge new area incorporating Ohio and the Great Lakes region. The establishment of this new territory was fiercely resisted by native tribes, which led to the Northwest Indian War of 1785 to 1795. This involved a coalition of tribal forces, including parts of the Shawnee, Cherokee, Miami tribe, and others, in an attempt to resist this new settlement drive west of the United States. These were a bloody series of conflicts, which the U.S. views as the first in its long-running Indian Wars. The native forces were well supplied by their British allies, and at this point, so soon after the War of Independence, the U.S. military was in a weak position. As a result, there were large victories and defeats experienced on both sides, with the high point of the native campaign likely being at the Battle of Wabash. Here, a significant chunk of the U.S. armed forces, led by General Arthur St. Clair, were wiped out by the native coalition. Only 24 of the approximately 1,000 American soldiers escaped unharmed, making it the largest defeat for the U.S. Army by native forces in its history, and the highest casualty rate of any U.S. military action to date. U.S. forces would ultimately reorganize, and from 1792 to 1794 gradually grind down the native alliance. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Here in Maumee, Ohio, amongst a large area of trees recently felled by a tornado, native forces were scattered, putting an end to their resistance. In the subsequent 1795 Treaty of Greenville, native tribes were forced to cede most of their territory in modern-day Ohio, pushing them west into the newly designated Indian lands and freeing up Ohio's vast territory for full Euro-American control. An increase in immigration from the eastern seaboard states soon followed, with Ohio's population growing rapidly. In 1801, the population had already reached 45,000, enough to begin the process towards statehood. This finally occurred on February 19, 1803, when President Jefferson approved its state boundaries, making Ohio the 17th state of the nation. A region previously nothing more than a distant frontier for the East Coast colonists, now a key part of the expanding USA. A period of quiet state building was to be short-lived, though, as a new native uprising threatens to envelop Ohio. Some native groups had remained even after the Treaty of Greenville had forced most out, illustrating how it had done little to address broader regional issues between settlers and natives. It was this last coalition, alongside some returnees from further west, who were attempting to hold on to control of their remaining territory. The Shawnee tribe had proven themselves central to previous resistance efforts, and this time would be no different. A new and enigmatic Shawnee chief had been attracting attention amongst native Ohio communities, as well as within the U.S. government over the preceding years. His name was Tecumseh, and he would go on to gain a place in history as one of the most formidable native resistance leaders in North America, alongside the likes of Red Cloud and Geronimo. He also seemed to make an equally strong impression on Europeans who he met, with an encounter described by an English Major General who worked with him. He who attracted most of my attention was a Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, brother to the prophet. A more sagacious or a more gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. He was the admiration of everyone who conversed with him. Since 1809, Tecumseh had been surprisingly successful in uniting native groups of Western Ohio and beyond into a coalition which could resist the U.S. government's relocation attempts. By 1810, war had broken out, which included frequent skirmishes along the frontier areas of Ohio between settlers and native forces. As the War of 1812 opened up with Britain, the two conflicts merged, and British troops began to take a more active role alongside Tecumseh's warriors. However, following a British naval defeat to U.S. forces on Lake Erie in 1830, it seems British commitment to the war was on the decline. The final confrontation would occur at Moraviantown in October 1813, with a group of British forces fighting alongside Tecumseh's warriors. Heavily outnumbered by U.S. forces, the British element collapsed almost immediately, retreating from the battlefield. Tecumseh and his men remained to fight, but with the numerical disadvantage stood little chance. Tecumseh was killed during the battle, and with him also the end of the last organized indigenous resistance in Ohio. He was stripped and scalped, with other body parts taken as souvenirs, while his final whereabouts remain unknown. By the 1830s, the last remaining indigenous peoples had been removed west, a process culminating in the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and trial of terrors across the wider region. For Ohio, though, this was also the start of a new age. Alongside productive farms, which had been established over the previous decades, industry began to gain a foothold in these years. The first iron furnace opened near Youngstown in 1804. By the middle of the century, this number had risen to 48. Cleveland became a hub for much of this activity, with it being one of the largest iron and steel producers in the country by the 1850s. Other boom industries included meat processing, farm machinery production, and textile mills. The connection of Ohio to the growing national train network of the 1840s onwards also greatly aided this economic development, allowing for much quicker import and export of goods. Since the establishment of the Northwest Territory, Ohio had been a free state, and as the 1800s progressed, an increasingly prominent supporter of abolition. It became a key point on the Underground Railroad network by which escaped slaves from the South would attempt to travel to freedom in the northern states or Canada, for which Ohio offered great access. This inevitably raised tensions between the state and slave-holding Kentucky to the south, feeding into broader divisions within the USA in the years leading up to the Civil War. Ohio would play an important role in the bloody conflict. Its great river access, as well as railroad connections, made it a strategic hub for troop and supply movements. Not to mention its industrial base, which had grown rapidly over the previous decades, being put on war footing in support of the Union. It contributed more soldiers per capita than any other Union state, suffering up to 35,000 total deaths through the war. The state also produced some of the key Union leaders, including William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses Grant. While Ohio experienced some direct conflict on its territory, including at the Battle of Buffington Island, the state was by no means devastated at the end of the Civil War. As such, it was able to resume its upward economic trajectory fairly rapidly. This included continued growth of the steel industry, as well as a reputation as one of the best producers of agricultural and other machinery. These decades of growth had created a skilled workforce which proved attractive to businesses. This was also the age of the fledgling flight industry, whose pioneers included the Wright brothers. Two native Ohioans, they originally produced bicycles in the state, but would go on to set records in flight with their early aircraft. This legacy was built on in 1917 when Dayton also became home to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a crucial center for the U.S. Air Force to this day. The auto industry would follow too, drawn by the highly skilled workforce and industrial capacity. This included companies such as the Winton Motor Carriage Company, who, alongside others, helped to make Ohio a crucial point in the automotive industry supply chain by the 1920s. Not to mention Akron, Ohio becoming the rubber capital of the world. The Great Depression would have a severe impact on Ohio, especially with its reliance on industry, which underwent a huge demand shock in this period. In 1933, over 40% of the industrial workforce was unemployed in Ohio, with that number going up to around 80% unemployment in the industrial hub of Toledo. The knock-on effects of this for society were grave, and while Roosevelt's New Deal program would provide some relief, it would take World War II to really get the state back on its feet. Ohio was one of the key contributors to the U.S. war effort. Its industrial base was turned over to high-quality steel and armaments production, providing crucial supplies. Huge numbers of the rugged and iconic military jeeps were produced in the state, as well as the DuPont Company manufacturing chemical compounds used in aviation fuel and explosives at scale. Ohio's shipyards in Toledo and Cleveland helped produce vessels of many types, while Wright-Patterson Air Force Base also became a crucial center for aircraft research and development. Following the war, Ohio would see a continuation of the boom period over the coming decades. Its industries turned back towards non-military production, fueled by pent-up consumer demand from years of war and rationing. This was an age of general affluence in the U.S., with an explosion in home ownership and a new baseline established for a property-owning working class. the state's suburbs experienced a period of rapid growth as wealth flowed outwards from centers. Through the 1970s, Ohio, like its neighbor Illinois, would experience a severe hit to its industry. This was fueled by many factors, including increasing overseas competition, and led to a period of heightened unemployment, hardship, and urban degeneration in places. However, Ohio was able to adapt, and despite lingering issues from the period, successful diversification into the electronics, aerospace, and other tech areas helped build a new economic base. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base also remained a big employer and helped cement the state's edge in the aerospace and technology research fields. Into the present day, and Ohio remains a vibrant and dynamic state. It has multiple leading higher education institutions and helps draw in a younger demographic and new talent, as well as beautiful and varied geography, which contributes significant tourist income, around $35 billion in 2021 alone. From the days of the Hopewell and Adena cultures through early native contact with European settlers and on to U.S. settlement and state building, Ohio has a rich and varied history. It provides a unique insight into many of the key periods of the formation of modern America, not to mention some of the most intense frontier action of any state. It has maintained an important position within the nation since its foundation, and looks set to do so well into the future.